My name is Kevin Schattenkirk. I am honors faculty in music, and my area of expertise is ethnomusicology and music history. Woodstock happened in August 15th to the 18th of 1969. It was billed as 3 days of peace, love, and music, or something along those lines, and it's sort of been romanticized as a really important moment for the counterculture in terms of amplifying the values of the movement, peace and love and social justice. And over the decades, Woodstock has sort of been heralded as kind of the apex of that particular movement. And like a lot of other events in history, it may not be quite so simple. But the idea of amplifying those values is certainly attached to that particular movement. The counterculture movement is more or less the psychedelic rock era, the hippies, the counterculture being a group of people that more or less emerged out of San Francisco, but not exclusively. It emerged out of England. The Beatles were a big part of the counterculture, but also bands like the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and so on, espousing values, broadly speaking, pertaining to peace, love, social justice, and musically really putting a lot of those values into song lyrics and into the meanings of their songs, but also embodying an element of psychedelic rock and that type of sound. So not quite hard rock, but also not quite blues-based rock either, but sort of with an eye toward how do we push rock forward. People gathered at a farm for 3 days to hear music about peace and love and heard new young artists. Some of the key people were a young band called Creedence Clearwater Revival with the lead singer John Fogerty. They were the first band to sign on, and that was a big deal. There was also another young new band out of San Francisco called Santana. Some of the other key people who signed on were Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and also what a lot of people tend to agree is maybe one of the best performances of Woodstock was Jimi Hendrix, who closed out the festival. So the idea of peace, love, harmony, people communing together over 3 days in this field at this farm to listen to musicians, that has generally been kind of enough to kind of create a romanticized idea of this is the apex of the counterculture. Some of the elements that often get overlooked have been talked about by some of the musicians that participated. For instance, John Fogerty of Creedence Clearwater Revival said that the band went on so early in the morning on one of the days that they walked out on stage to a sea of people who were passed out, only to see a guy who appeared to be about half a mile back lighting a cigarette and yelling out, "Hey John, we're with you." Him and his buddies, and Fogerty looked and thought, well, okay, I guess we're playing to them. To Neil Young, who really loathed the idea, the kind of performative nature of what Woodstock was supposed to be all about. Woodstock was being filmed or televised. We said we believed in these things as the counterculture, and what have we done? Are we really enacting peace and love and social justice for people who have been oppressed? You know, what's the deal with the movement? Have we achieved these things? And we probably haven't. There are some notable people who were absent from the festival. Joni Mitchell didn't play, but she said she watched it on TV, but she stayed, I believe, in California because she had an appearance on a talk show the next day. So Joni Mitchell wasn't there, but she wrote a song about it for Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young that she ended up recording herself called Woodstock. But Bob Dylan was another one who elected not to perform at Woodstock, and he actually lived in the area. And he's never explained why he didn't perform at Woodstock. So some of the kind of critiques that have been leveled at Woodstock have sort of been from implication, right? People who weren't there and didn't perform there who could have been. But some of the other criticisms that arose from Woodstock had to do with some of the participants who were there who were talking about the size of the crowd descending not just on the festival itself, but upon the town. There were issues having to do with food, water, cleanliness, drugs, even sexual assault in some cases, that have all sort of been sort of in the background of this sort of romanticized thing that was supposed to be a transformative moment. And for some people, it actually was a transformative moment. But for other people, sort of as problematic as any other event in history, I guess. The social and political values that were often associated with the counterculture had a lot to do with social justice. Racial justice was a value, attempting to pick up from the civil rights movement, but also feminism, some of the early stages of second wave feminism, and this idea of equal rights, equal pay for women in the workplace. But this idea, this value of social justice was certainly an important value. When I talk about Woodstock in class, in the one class in particular that it does come up in, History of Rock, I'll be honest, it's at a point where we're kind of trying to get from the Beatles and the Beach Boys and Woodstock to as close to now as possible. But one thing we do talk about when it comes to Woodstock or any other point in time in the past is talking about how it reflected youth culture at the time. Culturally, I think we just moved on to the next thing. Youth culture had moved on to the next thing. Post-Woodstock, I don't know that I would necessarily describe it as the counterculture fizzling out, in so much as that there were still bands from the counterculture era that were still playing and still writing and recording and touring. But what we saw culturally was an interesting kind of shift, where somebody like Neil Young was even turning away from the sound of psychedelic music to somebody who wasn't part of Woodstock at all and often not affiliated with Woodstock, but somebody like David Bowie emerging out of the UK, who really called into question the idea of authenticity in the counterculture and in psychedelic rock. But I find it fascinating in a lot of the same ways that I find somebody like Elvis fascinating, where they represent something to a lot of people, but when you start really kind of digging into the story, there's a lot of complexity and a lot of nuance and a lot of points for discussion. I think Woodstock really kind of functions in a way to remind us about what it means to claim certain values, right? If we're part of a movement or part of a community of people and that ascribe to a certain set of values and we claim those values as our own, then I think the lesson of something like Woodstock can really be something that we look at to keep ourselves in check. How are we living these values?